Dan Maher, welcome to Australian Musician.
Thank you for having me, Greg. It's great to be here.
Dan, what was the spark that lit your fire for music in the first place?
It's a bit of an interesting entry into guitar playing because I was actually a massive rap head in my early teens. I was very much into hip hop and didn't really have a whole lot of interest in playing. And then I heard a solo on an Eminem track called "Sing for the Moment," which samples "Dream On" by Aerosmith. And there's this guitar solo at the end of it. And it's not really much now that I listen back to it, but at the time when I was a 12-year-old kid, it just blew my mind. And I was so inspired to play. And I asked Dad if I could have a guitar, and he agreed. And that was pretty much how it all started for me.
Yeah.
So it actually came out of an Eminem track, which is kind of bizarre. Most people hear like a Guitar Hero and go, "Wow, I want to do that," but came out of hip hop for me actually. So
Aerosmith have got quite a connection with hip hop, haven't they?
they do. They had the Run DMC version of Walk This Way, and yeah, they've
Yeah.
had a few things over the years.
So once you started getting into guitar, what kind of things were you listening to? What kind of albums?
Mostly rock back in the day. Like Kiss was my favorite band in like early high school, and then bled into a bit more sophisticated rock things like Van Halen and Toto, and bands like that. I used to listen to a lot of Pink Floyd and the Doobie Brothers because that's a lot of the stuff that my dad was listening to at the time, and dad was musical as well. He played bass, and not professionally, but it was enough for me to sort of be around it a bit. But yeah, so it was mostly like sort of classic rock bands from a Deep Purple as well, like all the classics from the 70s and the 80s
Yeah.
and stuff
So
like that. So
what was your first guitar?
I had a Samick Strat copy. Do you remember Samick? Yeah, it was a very like I remember going down to the music store with my dad, and it was like $150, and you got a little amp, like a 10-watt amp, and a pick, and a tuner, and a book, and a strap, and the whole thing. It was like an all-inclusive package, and it was very cheap, but man, it did the job, and
Yeah.
it inspired me. And then Dad went overseas for work, and he brought me back a Strat, like a real Strat. And my life just changed forever. I just was so shocked and inspired by that, and I still use that guitar to the day. So
Yeah. So who were the guitarists you were listening to and trying to copy their licks?
well, back then, like based on the bands I was listening to, was a lot of Eddie Van Halen, a lot of Ace Frehley, and my ultimate hero, who I know you've interviewed several times, Steve Lukather. He is my like ultimate hero, and I'm very, very jealous that you've had the chance to speak with him on several occasions. Yeah, he's still to this day my ultimate guitar hero. But yeah, I was listening to a lot of even Dave Gilmour back in the day. Yeah, I was listening to a lot of that kind of early rock. So
Yeah. And
um,
what was your first pro gig? When did you start playing in bands and getting paid for it?
I remember my first pro gig, and it was just a covers. Well, I mean, if you're considering pro as in like getting paid like a decent gig free fee, I remember getting a call like maybe a few months after I finished high school to play at Three Wise Monkeys, which is an iconic pub here in Sydney. And it was just a covers thing. It wasn't anything spectacular, but I remember someone was like, "You're gonna get paid $300 to do this," and that was that was anything. Sorry, like nothing I'd ever heard of before. Is being paid $300 to do a gig. I'd been playing for amateur theatre up at that point for virtually no money, and in my bedroom and with my high school band at Battle of the Bands. So to actually get paid a few $100s to go out and play music for a night was pretty special to me back then. But as far as like big, you know, uh, bigger production level sort of stuff, my first real like fancy gig was getting to play on Jersey Boys, the musical. It was at the State Theatre here in Sydney, and I was just a dep on it, but I was 19 years old, and I'd never experienced anything so professional before. And there was a lot of learning involved in that, not only in terms of the parts, but just in terms of learning curve of the industry in general. I was just a young kid and I didn't really know a whole lot back then, but to be thrown in the deep end of something like that was just wild to me. So
Yeah. You've got a pretty impressive resume. When you
thank
look
you.
back at your career, what would you say are your real highlights?
There's a lot of things that I've done that I've really enjoyed and that I look back on really fondly. and a lot of them sort of geared in the TV world. I remember, Dancing with the Stars was being in the house band for that was a really amazing gig for me because I think, it wasn't a singing contest. And so all the vocals that happened from the show were part of the house band as well. And it was just, we were just a band that got to rock out every week. And what you play doesn't really dictate whether someone else progresses in a competition because it's a dancing contest. So that was a really interesting gig for that reason. And I mean, I've worked with a bunch of people that I really respect and that I've really admired over the years, people like Ronan Keating and Rita Ora and Adam Lambert and all these people that I've grown up like listening to. That for me is really, it's really special to like hear a song on the radio if I'm in the shops or something like that and go, I've played that song with that artist. Like that to me means something, but yeah, like pretty much as far as like notable gigs that I've done that are special to me, yeah, pretty much any of the TV things, the Dancing with the Stars, The Voice, Australian Idol right now, I'm currently on that. And that to me is a really special one because I was a young kid watching the original Australian Idol band and I was so inspired to, like, that's pretty much was a turning point for me in terms of where I wanted my career to head. I remember being a 12-year-old kid emailing Rex Go and Simon Hosford and Chris Kamzelis, the original guys in the Idol band back in the day. And I was just emailing them as a young kid going, how do I do this? Like, give me some advice on how to get into this area of the industry. What do I need to know? What do I need to do? And they were wonderful. They really guided me. And now to be sort of in my early 30s now doing that same gig, it's like a bit of a full circle moment for me. So I'm really, yeah, that's a really big highlight for me in itself.
So what are the key attributes that you need to get gigs like Idol or The Voice?
For starters, like I think people underestimate what it means to sort of be a team player because on those gigs it's really not about you at all. Like it's really, you got to just know your part in the band, in the music, in the song. You kind of just got to stick to your part and sort of have the discipline to not overcomplicate things or not overplay. And as well, like I think a lot of people think it comes down to strictly just music or playing but just your personality helps a lot when it comes to that because there's a lot of downtime on those gigs, like there's a lot of, you play and then you sit around for an hour while producers and creatives sort of chat about, the segment of the show and stuff like that. And then you'll run the song again. But in that downtime, you've got to be a good hang. You've got to talk back like you're chatting with the band. And it's important to like be an enjoyable person to be around. But as far as like playing goes, I think it's really just about being versatile, sort of knowing your place in the music and your role in the band, like I mentioned. But there's so many little tiny things that you don't even realize, like the amount of times I've come close in the past on TV to like having my volume up on the guitar and having the right patch, but having my volume pedal down and at the last second catching that and going, oh, that could have been really bad. There's just so many little checks. You got to make sure the capo's on the right fret, you're in tune and you got the chart on the right page. And, I've had things happen where on like a live show of The Voice, I had my iPad, right, where I'm reading my chart and I had the internet connected. And so I got a FaceTime call from someone, like, so the whole screen of my chart that we're playing live just filled up with this phone call incoming and just things like that, like little tiny things that you learn along the way that really make it smooth for you to nail a gig like that. I think a lot of things come down to troubleshooting more than, what to do if things go wrong rather than how to do things right in the first place.
Are you trained in music theory? I guess you are to be able to do those sort of things.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, yes, I am. I know my theory and I've done a lot of gigs that require that, but I don't have any training at a tertiary level, if that's what you mean. I've studied under a lot of teachers over the years, in a lot of different styles. I've done a lot of jazz training with a guy called Saul Richardson, who's a bit of a jazz education legend here in Sydney. Brilliant guitar player, and I studied with him throughout the last couple of years of high school, because I was really interested in studying jazz more at a tertiary level, and I got into uni for that, and then never ended up going. I ended up going on a Japan contract for a year, which was a great gig. But I ended up coming back to Australia and never really going back to uni. And the phone started ringing, and I just never really looked back. So, but yes, theoretically, I think you have to know your stuff. Certainly to a degree, you got to be able to read music, and you got to be able to understand harmony and things like that to really do that gig well, I think.
Yeah. So what's the difference between a stage show like Jersey Boys and a TV show like Idol?
There's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of differences as well. It's like, I mean, for starters, on a show like Jersey Boys, you're in a pit. Like, you're not even in a pit, actually. You're in a room out the back of the theater, and you kind of get lured into a false sense of security as to like the impact of what you're doing. Because you might think, for example, if you make a little mistake, you might think it was quite insignificant, but then it's going out to 2,500 people in the house, and you don't really know where you're sitting in the mix at that point. So there's pressure in that sense, but it also takes the pressure off a little bit because you can just relax and do your thing. You don't have to be on as much. But there's similarities in the sense of like, you still got to be able to play the click. You've got to be able to know your role, and you've got to play your part and just stick to the part pretty much, because it's all about the unit. Like, you've got to be a well-oiled machine and know your role in the whole scheme of the show. And TV is very similar to that, but there's a different pressure, I think, when you're on camera. And in rehearsal, you can be fine and chill and not nervous at all, and then the minute that the audience is in the house and the judges are sitting in their seat and the cameras are on and the lights are red, like, there's definitely an added layer of pressure. So I think that's the biggest difference, is like dealing with nerves. And I think ultimately, for me at least, that's just come down to trusting myself and to not getting in my head about anything. And because, I mean, also, by the time you end up playing the song on a show, you've rehearsed it 10, 15, 20 times, and you pretty much know what you're doing. I think if you just trust in yourself, you've got a pretty good thing going.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So, gear-wise, on a show like Idol, do you have one guitar and amp situation that's versatile, or do you have to take a collection of guitars?
Well, I mean, I could probably do the show on like one or two guitars, but I really like to use these shows as like an opportunity to use every single guitar that I have, because I've got a lot over the years. I'm a bit of a guitar collector in that sense. I'm still in the earlier years of it, but I got about 30-ish guitars myself, and a lot of them are not everyday guitars. You just bring them out for a specific thing. But I use a show like Australian Idol or any of the other shows to really use all the tools that I have at my disposal. So pretty much on the show, I'm using, I mean, week to week, it's different depending on the type of music we're playing. But for the most part, I'm using like a American Pro Strat and American Pro Telly. I'm using a Derek Trucks Signature SG. I'm a big Derek Trucks fan. I don't know about you, but I just adore his playing. And that's a very odd, it's not your standard SG. That SG, I don't know if you've ever played one, but it's where the first fret would be on a standard SG. Oh, sorry, first fret would be on a standard SG is where the third fret is on the Signature. So it's quite a long neck. And the minute you take your hands off the neck, the whole body just shifts and the headstock falls to the ground. It's kind of a bizarre one to play, but I also play an Ibanez AS153, which is like a semi-hollow jazz thing. And I'm using it Steve Luke at the Luke 1 and Luke 2. I've one of every iteration of that guitar, Luke 1, Luke 2, and Luke 3. Like I told you, I'm a massive Steve Luke at the fan. And for my acoustic, I'm using a Mastin Custom Shop 808, which is a beautiful acoustic. And yeah, I mean, they're probably the most common ones, but I'm using like a Cole Clark 12 string as well. I'm using an FGN, sorry, Odyssey Custom Shop as well, which is a Japanese Strat copy basically. So I'm using a whole bunch of different guitars just because I like to be very particular about sounds and authenticity when it comes to replicating songs and tones and stuff like that. And as for the amp situation, I'm actually running digitally. So I'm running through a Kemper Profiler. And I never ever considered myself a digital guy until a few years back when I needed to for this kind of work. And I was always an amp guy, always analog, pedal board, everything. And I still do use those for like live gigs where I need just general sounds. But for anything where I'm just, I'm dialing in specific sounds and everything needs to be exactly the same in rehearsal versus the show itself, like I just find Kemp has been the game changer for me in that sense.
I've seen photos of you with a MIDI keyboard. How does that come into play?
I mean, I enjoy playing piano a lot and like keyboards, but I'm very limited when it comes to that. So I can like learn a part if it's sort of within my capabilities, and thankfully a lot of pop music is. So if a gig requires me to like play a little bit of keys as well as guitar, especially if I'm at the helm of it, like if I'm putting together the tracks and running playback and stuff like that, and I can kind of dictate what I do and don't play and can leave certain things in the track that maybe I don't actually or can't physically play myself. I'll play what I can on the keys. But again, I'm very limited, but I do really enjoy playing piano and keyboards. So if I can play it on a gig, I probably will opt to always do that as well.
What kind of studio setup do you have at home?
I pretty much run everything in the box. Like I don't really have any outboard gear besides the Kemper itself. So pretty much everything I do is just all with plugins. And it's just very simple. I just have my MacBook and plug a UAD Apollo Twin as my interface, and I just run my Kemper into there. Sometimes I use Guitar Rig depending on who I'm sending stems to, because if it's a producer who wants, it's interesting. I would have always thought that producers would want like very basic and unprocessed stems so that they can mess with them and make them sound how they want for the track that they're working on. But these days, more often than not, I'm noticing producers like effects and everything printed on the track. So I've been actually running my Kemper for a lot of sessions into Logic rather than sending like just plain audio tracks out, because for some reason everyone just likes to have the effects printed. I think it's less work for them in mixing maybe. And but yeah, so as far as like the actual gear I'm using, it's all very simple, like pretty much just Kemper into the Apollo Twin and then into Logic, and then fire them off.
So how did you go during the COVID lockdowns? Did you find yourself spending more time in the studio?
Oh, that's literally all I was doing every day. I was waking up and I was practicing and I was making beats, and I was getting more and more heavily into the actual production side of music rather than just tracking guitars. Like, because music production for me had always been such a mystified thing. Like it was just a big question mark. I didn't really understand what happened from start to finish before the song went on the radio, and it all sounds very flash and polished. And I was just so intrigued. I've been intrigued my whole life, but my focus had always been on playing, so I never really got too deep into it. And so in the lockdowns, which were pretty brutal, nothing like what you guys had in Melbourne, though. You had the longest lockdown in the history of the world or something like that.
Tell me about
I heard. Yeah, you poor thing. Yeah, I always felt for everyone in Melbourne back then, because we had it pretty good up here comparatively in Sydney. But so I just pretty much woke up every day and would do a couple of hours of practice, a couple of hours of beat making, learning music production, have a lunch break, a couple of hours guitar practice, make another beat, eat, sleep, wash, rinse, repeat, pretty much for 5 months. And it was very miserable. I lived by myself and couldn't really see anyone, and I got pretty down, and it was just hard to be inspired, but I just figured if there was any time to upskill and diversify what I can do, then that was the time. I didn't have any songs to learn. I didn't have any work really. I had a few sessions here and there, but so I tried to use it to the best of my ability, but it definitely was a bit of a struggle.
Yeah. What about your own material? You're always working for somebody else. So do you write much for yourself? Have you released anything? Any plans for the future?
It's funny that you say that, because I've never been interested in my own music until recently. Like I've always been the kind of guy I've always come up with. I've got hundreds of ideas. I've got hundreds of like little songs, and mostly like fingerstyle acoustic things. I love shredding on guitar, on electric guitar and stuff like that. But everything I tend to write seems to be mostly like in the acoustic fingerstyle sort of thing. And I have all these ideas. Like I have a whole catalog of ideas that wouldn't take much to really, put together a little body of work and release something. And that's actually one of my goals for this year, is to finally get that out into the world. But yeah, like you said, I've just really spent most of my time in my career so far, helping bring other people's ideas to life, and other people's music to fruition. So my own creativity in sense of writing my own stuff has sort of been put on the back burner, but it's definitely something that I'm getting more and more interested in the older I get. And so yeah, I can definitely say that there'll be stuff coming out sooner than later.
Okay. So
Definitely so.
what's the grand plan for Dan Maher?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I love where I'm at right now, but I want to keep taking things to higher and higher levels. I want to keep moving more up into, my own artistry. I want to keep releasing my own, well, I say keep releasing as if I've released stuff already, but I want to start releasing and keep releasing from there my own music. I want to work more. I just want to work with everybody and anybody really, and keep just pushing whatever limitations I've put on myself over the years. I want to keep breaking boundaries, and I want to keep working on a higher and higher level. I want to, work more overseas. I've worked a lot with artists who have come from overseas and worked with them here, but I want to start working more internationally with people, and branching out into more music production and producing for artists and music directing and all those kinds of things. I want to kind of just keep, kind of taking what I've already got and keep expanding on it. So that's sort of the plan for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, it's been great to talk to you, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg. It's been a pleasure.